Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, finally, I get to talk about Aphex Twin's Selected Ambient Works Volume 2. So, everybody seems to like Aphex Twin's debut album, but his follow-up was a lot more polarizing. I've seen tons of people praise this album, but I've also seen tons of people say it was crap. I will say this, Volume 2 is definitely much more abstract and difficult than its predecessor, though the debut was really accessible and easy to get into. Its follow-up was not. In fact, I don't think it's even right to call this album a follow-up, as the overall sound is vastly different from the debut. To be totally honest, I think it would be kind of a stretch to call 8592 ambient. I mean, it's great and all, but ambient music is all about the atmosphere. When reviewing ambient music, you don't look at melodies or rhythms. You look at moods and textures. I mean, 8592 had ambient elements, but the focus there was more on the melodies and the rhythms rather than the overall atmosphere. But here on Volume 2, the atmosphere is pretty much the entire selling point. This is real ambient music, purely meant as background music to evoke a certain mood or just sound like it came from another planet. The question is, though, is it actually good? Well, yeah, of course it is. The weird thing about this album is that while I do still prefer 8592, I'm starting to think that this album is objectively better. 8592 has a lot of personal nostalgia for me. I've listened to it over and over for years, and it still holds up great to this day. But, I first heard Volume 2 at around the same time as I heard 8592, and back then I was just like, I don't get it. Though I return to it occasionally, I never really listened to it enough to develop a sense of nostalgia for it. But as time went on, it slowly started to grow on me, and in preparation for this review, it's really begun to click with me in a way I didn't even see coming. Though there's no catchy melodies I grew up with, it's twice as long and has the substance and variety to back it up. Now, this version that I have on CD here, this version has 23 tracks, which means that 2 tracks unofficially titled Hanky and Stone in Focus are missing. So, I literally just heard those 2 tracks for the first time while writing this review. But I'll get to them at the end, as I'm not used to them being among the track listing, and the album has worked fine for all these years without them. Oh yeah, that's right. None of the songs on this album, save for Blue Calx, have any official titles, and are instead associated with a bunch of photos, many of which are totally out of focus, and have pie charts to show which track is which, based on the vinyl sides. I've spent quite a bit of time trying to wrap my head around how people got to these unofficial titles, especially the really out-of-focus ones like Z-Twig, which didn't even look like a twig as far as I could see, or even Z-shaped. But since referring to these tracks by their track numbers is going to be really confusing, not to mention inconsistent depending on what version you have, I'll, of course, be using the unofficial titles, since hopefully everybody here knows them by those titles. But let's get into the music itself. I've got 25 tracks to talk about. Now, all of these songs seem very much inspired by the work of Brian Eno, albeit much darker, creepier, and unwelcoming compared to Eno's usual stuff. At least for the most part. Actually, the album begins with one of the more comforting and welcoming tracks, Cliffs. There's a bunch of voice samples here, which I won't imitate for the sake of not ruining it for everybody, along with some subtle synth washes. But my favorite parts of this track are when these cool synth arpeggios come in near the end. It is more welcoming than most of the other tracks on here, but even this one just feels a touch unsettling underneath the surface. Radiator is very metallic and atonal, but oddly catchy and memorable. Rhubarb is probably the single most calming and welcoming track on the album. There's no voice samples here, just ambient synth chords and slow melodies, simple but effective. Grass is once again very atonal and dark. More like walking through a big underground parking lot or something. Admittedly, this one kind of evaporates from my head after it's done, but it's cool while it lasts. Mold is short and focused around a creepy voice sample. Curtains is not short, and focused around a repetitive and creepy synth melody. Blur introduces something not previously heard on the album. A beat! Well, Grass might have technically had a beat, but it's extremely understated there. On Blur, it's at the forefront. It's very slow and plodding, and with some kind of ticking clock sounds. Weathered Stone is also beat-centered and mechanical and machine-like, but surprisingly not that creepy compared to some of the others on here. Tree is one of the creepier tracks, kind of based around this slow, bass-heavy synth wash, with some atonal and off-pitch melodies sprinkled here and there. Domino is similar to Curtains in that it's kind of based around a repetitive synth melody and doesn't have much else going on, though this one's a bit more atonal. White Blur 1 ends the first disc and fittingly stands out, with lots of voice samples, dark and bassy synth pads, and wind chimes. It's short, but it's definitely memorable, and the wind chime sounds in particular make this one of my favorites. Blue Calx begins the second disc, and this track is kind of like the opposite of Cliffs in that it's primarily very cold and mechanical, but it has an underlying warmness to it. It technically has a beat carried on by a quiet clock ticking noise, and occasional little synth stabs, but the synth chords and pads give it that more welcoming feeling, kinda like being in an empty chemistry lab or something. Parallel Stripes has this almost angelic melody that sounds like some kind of choir, but is constantly in competition with this buzzing synth pad that sounds like a running refrigerator. Shiny Metal Rods sticks out by being almost entirely percussion-driven. It's kinda like the darker and more intense cousin to Weathered Stone. Gray Stripe at first sounds like a bunch of howling wind sounds echoing through a metal chamber, but occasionally brings in a few atonal and abstract synth phrases. Then, almost as if to directly contrast Gray Stripe, we get Z-Twig, which has a lot of very bright synth, xylophone-ish sounds. You'd never see this song coming, but it's all the more memorable because of that. Windowsill is based around this creepy and dark flute loop, with a lot of tribal-sounding percussion. Hexagon is the closest thing we get to a song that could have fit on 8592, with a bright and happy but still kind of downplayed synth melody, and a fairly bouncy beat similar to that of Weathered Stone. Then there's Lichen, which is probably the closest we get to something that sounds like Brian Eno. A lot of high, flute-ish sounds, and a bunch of warm and comforting synth chords, ending up feeling like a slightly less human counterpart of the Eno track, An Ending Ascent. But then we go right back to the dark stuff on Spots, which feels like being inside some kind of engine room or something. There's a lot of voice samples, which are so echoey that they might not even be recognized as such, as well as plenty of dark and atonal synth washes, of course. Tassels is mainly based around this buzzing, electric-sounding synth bass and repetitive synth pad. Feels like standing next to a power line, or as Richard James himself put it when describing the album as a whole, like being in a power station on acid. White Blur 2 is like Curtains and Domino, based around repetitive and creepy synth melody. With some weird gurgling and buzzing in the background and a repetitive sample of someone laughing. This is probably my least favorite track on the album, as at 11 minutes it went on a bit too long for its own good. The album finally ends with Matchsticks, which is centered around some dark synth chord pads, which is surprisingly tonal, but still reminds me more of like an alien abduction or something. It's almost like a rhythmless Jean-Michel Jarre track. So now that we've gotten through all the tracks on the version of the album that I'm used to, let's talk about the two missing tracks. Hanky. probably the single creepiest song on the entire album. And that's really saying something. It's very atonal and screechy, with even some organ sounds thrown in for good measure. It's almost like not subtle enough to fit on the album, but I think it works okay. But then there's Stone in Focus, which is mostly focused around a bass-heavy, rumbling, and surprisingly tonal synth wash, with some occasional slow clock-ticking noises and some other synth melodies here and there, like the darker cousin to Rhubarb. Now, despite the fact that it's just over 10 minutes long and doesn't have much going on, I never really felt like it overstayed its welcome. It's kind of like more floating out in deep space without any way to return home. I saw the comment section of people listening to this song, like, questioning their religion, wondering what will happen to them when they die, whether they will hear this song when they die. It's a weirdly powerful song, and while I think the album works okay without it, it would have made for one of the more memorable additions to the track listing. So overall, this album has a lot to like about it. I won't judge you if you don't like it, as it is very dark and foreboding. There are lots of tracks that have little to nothing in the way of progression, and it can be difficult to listen to if you're not in the right mood, but I say this is one of the best ambient albums I've ever had the pleasure of hearing. It has taken a few years to slowly and progressively grow on me, but in the end, I'd say it was well worth the trouble. Again, I still prefer the more welcoming and more instantly gratifying tones of 85-92, but this is still a beautiful album, and I highly recommend it. Overall, I'm feeling a solid 9 out of 10. Favorite tracks: Cliff, Rhubarb, Weathered Stone, White Blur 1, Blue Calx, Shiny Metal Rods, Twig, Windowsill, Hexagon, Lichen, Matchsticks, and you know what? Stone in Focus, too. Least favorite track? White Blur 2. But, of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it. Leave the comments in the comment thing and all the rest of it. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.